So what we're going to do is we have a panel of three knowledgeable individuals. Lord Bruce is one of them, and two others who I'm about to introduce, who will talk about the impact and the enduring impact and value of the Declaration of Arbroath and its impact beyond Scotland. Let me introduce our other two speakers, and then we'll get right into it. Professor Donna Heddle is with us. She's director of the award-winning University of the Highlands and Islands Institute for Northern Studies. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Heddle last year, Tartan Day in Washington, D.C., where she was able to join us personally. And she was with us remotely at last year's Scottish North American Conference, which was held in Detroit. A little bit about Dr. Heddle. She sits on the board of Museums and Galleries for Scotland, is a trustee of the late Sir Sean Connery's Scottish International Education Trust, which has been a benefit to many Scottish Americans. Her most recent work, academic work, has been on the Vikings, on the nature of the North, particularly with reference to Scotland as early maps and literature describe it. She's been working on tourism-based virtual Scottish history trails linked to distilleries across Scotland, and working on COVID recovery tourism plans for the South Pacific. Very wide-ranging interests. Dr. Heddle has also been developing a new Master's in Literature course in Scottish Heritage, which is run for the first time this year very successfully at the University of Highlands and Islands. Also involved in Viking studies, Orkney and Shetland studies, and cultural and heritage programs. Let me give a little plug for the University of Highlands and Islands. We at this conference and others of us working in Scottish heritage events have had lots of interaction with them in the last few years. It is the newest university in Scotland, the only one based in the Highlands, provides award-winning programs taught by experts, which are available on your home computer in a format to suit you. Many, many choice offerings, 13 colleges and research centers across the Highlands and Islands contribute. So I'm sure Professor Heddle will tell us a little bit more about the University of Highlands and Islands during her remarks. I understand she can trace her family history back to the 6th century in Scotland and has had ancestors who have fallen in every major conflict in Scottish history. Hopefully that's not going to continue. Books are among her recent works. What is the North? Imagining the North from Ancient Times to the Present Day. That's published in 2020, brand new. And Vikings and Vikings, the Norse Worlds of the History Channel series, published last year. Professor Donna Heddle is also going to be joined by Graeme Mackenzie. Let me introduce Graeme briefly, and then we'll go directly into the panel. Graeme is a Scottish historian and genealogist with over 30 years experience researching and writing about the Highland clans. He is president of the Association of Highland Clans and Societies and operates Highland Roots, a professional genealogical firm, and he is based in Inverness. He studied history at Cambridge and worked initially as a rock music writer and broadcaster, developing an interest in country and bluegrass music while helping organize the prestigious Cambridge Folk Festival. And I've had the honor and privilege of meeting Graeme and working with him on his several trips to America as a lecturer on genealogy issues. And he was with us at the Scottish North American Conference last year in person in Detroit. So I'm going to turn this over to the panelists. I believe Lord Bruce is going to start, and they're going to handle how they want to proceed from there. To you, sir.
We had a discussion previously, John, that I was going to establish the context in which the declaration can be considered. And Donna and Graeme are going to focus on other aspects. So I think we should move on quickly to them so they can begin to open up another way of looking at the declaration's importance.
Righto, well, I suspect it's me to start. Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to you all from the Orkney Islands of Scotland, where, of course, it is late afternoon at the moment, so it's rather dark out there because we are at 59 north, just almost the very top of our beloved Scotland. I'm delighted to be with you today. It was lovely to speak to you last year, and I'm looking forward to coming over in person, hopefully next year, if the situation allows. Now, what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is the actual Declaration of Arbroath itself. Now, 2020, of course, as we all know, marked the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath, which is widely seen as Scotland's most iconic document. This fragile document and its evocative sentiments of medieval sovereign independence have given it special distinction, not just in Scotland, but around the world. But the thing is, we are all familiar with the concept of the Declaration of Arbroath. We're all familiar with a particularly important key quote in there, but how much do we actually know about the document? What does it actually look like? It was supposed to be put on public exhibition this year between the end of March and beginning of April for good reason, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and see if I can show you what it looks like, if technology allows. All right, just bear with me a moment, folks. And starting the slideshow now. And I hope you can see that. Okay, you should be able to see that and a small tiny vignette of myself in the corner. So it hasn't been seen for a long time. You can see that it is a very fragile document here. This is a example of it here. It was a document that was written in Latin. It was sealed by 8 earls and about 40 barons, and we can see what those. There's a close-up of the writing for you to show it to you, but show you the seals there, just to show you it. It's strange how often people have no idea what this document actually looks like. This was a real thing. This is a real paper and ink affair, although of course it has so much more resonance than that. And although the Declaration of Arbroath was damaged during its absence from Edinburgh Castle, the full text was actually known, the full text that we have today is actually known from an engraving made in the early 18th century. There we are. By William Hume Lysers and Daniel Lysers. There it is. So that's basically what we rely on for our knowledge of the text. It's very much based on that original that I showed you. Now, who wrote it? That's another question. That's another moot question. We know it was planned by a group of people who met at Newbattle Abbey College. We know this, but the author of this noble address is unknown, although it's assumed to have been composed by Bernard de Linton, the Abbot of Arbroath and Chancellor of Scotland. Above the seals of the 8 earls and the barons, it asked for the Pope's dispassionate intervention in the bloody quarrel between the Scots and the English. And so that you might understand the difference between the two, its preamble gave him a brief history of the former. Now, as Lord Bruce has already told us, this is an intelligent and clever document. And the intent of showing the longevity of the country of Scotland by tracing back our ancestry to Scythia and places like that is important. It's placing Scotland very firmly in the canon of ancient nations. So it's very careful. For us, when we read it now, we're taking this with a little bit of a pinch of salt when it comes to Scythia, right enough. But it was important, and it fitted in the whole neoclassical and classical antiquity concepts of the birth of nations as well. But what's important about this is the passionate sincerity of the men who believed it, who were placing a new and heady nationalism above the feudal obligations that had divided their loyalties less than a quarter of a century before. In this mixture of defiance and supplication, of interesting interpretations of history and noble thought and philosophical ideals, 2 things make the Declaration of Arbroath the most important document in Scottish history, she says, in a wild and sweeping manner, but nonetheless, I firmly believe it. Firstly, as Lord Bruce has alluded to previously too, it set the will and the wishes of the people above the king. Although they were bound to him both by law and his merits, it says, it was so that their freedom might be maintained. If he betrayed them, he would be removed and replaced. This remarkable obligation placed upon a feudal monarch by his feudal subjects may be explained in part by the fact that Bruce was still a heather king to many of them, still a wild claimant ruling upon sufferance and success. But the roots of his kingship were Celtic, and a Celtic tradition was here invoked, the memory of the 7 earls, the 7 sons of Cruithne the Pict, in whom it was believed had rested the ancient right of tanistry, the elevation of kings by selection. So this unique relationship of king and people would influence Scottish history henceforward, and would reach its climax actually in the Reformation and the century following, when a people's church would declare and maintain its superiority over earthly crowns. Secondly, most famously, the assertion asserts that for as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up with life itself. So it's highly significant from those points of view, but most people, most modern Scots know that particular quote. That's the one on the t-shirts and the tea towels. That's the ones that people weep over at Hogmanay, and I'm possibly not entirely innocent of that myself, indeed. It's a very emotive statement, indeed. But then what happened to this actual document that we're looking here? What happened to it? Well, as we know, it was part and parcel of a diplomatic package of appeal sent by the Scots to the Pope. What actually the result of it, in a nutshell, was that the Pope did indeed write to Edward II, but not until 1328. So in many ways, its apogee of influence was at the moment it was written. It was largely forgotten following its publication, and the Declaration of Arbroath was only rediscovered in the 17th century. And it was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that, as Michael Lynch, the eminent historian, has said, acquired the status of a surrogate Scottish constitution. In approximately 1,200 words, the Declaration reinforced for its audience the mythical foundation of Scotland, its desperation in the face of relentless attempts towards its subjugation, and its right to be recognised once again as a nation of its own, as it had been from the 9th century until 1296. And it came at a delicate time. Scotland was reeling from the exhaustion of the wars of independence, which saw it struggling against not only the might of England, but from internecine rivalries and civil war, as we've heard previously. And as I said, many modern Scots know the most famous passage from the Declaration. However, the passage that deserves international attention and which earns the Declaration of Arbroath's place among the great documents in the evolution of political thought immediately precedes this. But after all, if this prince, i.e. King Robert, shall leave these principles which he hath so nobly pursued, and consent that we or our kingdom be subjected to the king or people of England, we will immediately endeavour to expel him as our enemy, and as the subverter of both his own and our rights, and will choose another king who will defend our liberties. So there's Robert Bruce, Scotland's hero king, champion of the wars of independence, putting his name to a document, declaring in no uncertain terms that he would be driven out just the same as the English if he betrayed his nation's cause. How could such a thing be possible in the 14th century, an age of the divine right of kings and absolute monarchy? Well, the international appeal also includes the important idea that the monarch rules with consent and highlights the long-held desire for Scottish sovereignty and independence. In 1997, a United States Senate resolution stating the famous American Declaration of Independence was modelled on the inspirational document. The Declaration of Arbroath has been made part of the Memory of the World Programme of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, UNESCO, which aims to safeguard the documentary heritage of humanity, and so on. So in terms of the document itself, we have the significance there. But in many ways too, the real roots there, I was going to do a big chunk about Duns Scotus, but Lord Bruce has already done that, so I'll skip over that. So basically, a king or queen was therefore not one thanks to any right attained through wealth, title, or divine ascent, but because of their service to their people and community. The failure of Balliol to act as a steward for Scotland's best interests, combined with the disasters that befell Scotland during the Wars of Independence, gave the Duns Scotus conception of a custodian king a great deal of appeal. And of course, it helped that there was one ready-made in the person of Robert the Bruce. For the Scots, then, one of the consequences of the Wars of Independence was an emergent sense of a single political community and national identity. The publication of several works in the 14th and 15th centuries, amounting to an official history of Scotland, if you like, including Barbour's Bruce and Walter Bauer's Scotti Chronicon, helped to instill, I suppose, a hitherto unprecedented level of Scottish self-awareness, and Michael Lynch has again noted this. This self-awareness came alongside vigilance, not only against external enemies, but internal ones as well. Scots had learned the hard way that the national interest, the well-being of the people must be preserved against the constant threat of the waywardness and ambitions of those chosen to rule. So with the significance of the document, we have the significance of this early time for Scotland. But what was the legacy of the Declaration of Arbroath? Well, one of the most significant ones, of course, is the Declaration of Independence, which I briefly mentioned there. Perhaps 1/3 of the signatories of the American Declaration of Independence were of Scottish descent. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted it, even shared ancestry with Robert the Bruce. Both could trace their descent back to Malcolm III, and John Bellassai himself has written a very interesting paper on this. But it's not just the Declaration of Independence, although I'm speaking to an American audience today, it's not just the Declaration of Independence that owes so much to the Declaration of Arbroath. Come back to Scotland, we can trace clearly the influence of the Declaration of Arbroath in the claim of rights in 1689, which is when William and Mary ousted James II and VII from the throne of Great Britain, came over and took over. And the Scottish Parliament had a claim of rights controlling and defining the nature of the rule of the kings, because James II and VII was somewhat well wielded to the divine right of kings notion, indeed, which had not gone very well for his father, Charles I, if any of you remember. That had not worked out well at all, right? So we have the claim of rights in 1689, which clearly states how the country should be governed and the role of the sovereign in that governance, and the right of the people of Scotland to have the governance that they wish. Then later on, we move on to 1989, and on the 30th of March 1989, a new claim of rights was signed by a large swathe of local authorities, MPs, MEPs, and so on, in the Assembly Hall in the Mound in Edinburgh, and it clearly stated that Scotland had the right to govern itself and that improper government should be removed. Moving on then to 2011, this again was raised in the Scottish Parliament, which had in fact directly come about as a devolution had directly come about from that particular claim of rights in 1989. It was one of the founding principles. There was a signed document about that that clearly indicated that such a parliament should be there. So in 2011, it was raised again in the Scottish Parliament, and in 2012, it was debated and approved again. And finally, on the 4th of July, very suitable date, the 4th of July 2018, it was indeed passed and acknowledged in the House of Commons, the claim of rights of the people of Scotland to choose the government that best suited their needs. So we can see it clearly tracing its way through the history of Scotland. But we can also see that the Declaration of Arbroath did influence the minds and pens of these men and women who set their hearts to the work of democracy in the modern age. As we know, the Declaration of Independence many people were of Scottish descent, but there was also the connection there. Thomas Jefferson, to go back to him, was undoubtedly affected by the Declaration of Arbroath due to his education at the College of William and Mary under the Scotsman William Small, who Jefferson would describe as being as a father to him. More fundamentally, though, the Declaration of Arbroath was a deep chink in the armour of any system that sustained itself through the self-interested actions of the individuals in charge. Hence, its sentiments, whether consciously or not, would emerge again and again in struggles such as the French and American revolutions, as well as in the general popularisation of accountable political structures that would ultimately be expressed through the spread of the democratic government. So, the next time you hear someone utter the now cliched phrase that the Scots invented the modern world, which in many ways is true, you can reply with confidence and the words of the Declaration of Arbroath in your heart, more than you know. This notion of kingship would largely recede, of course, during the reign of the Stuart kings of Scotland and later Britain, who, especially during the reigns of James IV, Fifth and Sixth, entrenched absolute monarchy back into the depths of the Scottish political mindset. You wouldn't be remiss in asking then to what extent the Declaration of Arbroath changed the political scene at all, given its fall into obscurity very shortly after its reception at the papal court. There remained, however, a telling difference between Scottish kings and other European monarchs throughout the medieval period, and one that harkened back to the kingly ideal put forward by Duns Scotus. The King of Scots, until the Union of Crowns in 1603, was precisely that, the King of Scots, rather than the King of Scotland. It was a subtle difference, but in an age dominated by kings who asserted their authority over the very earth upon which their nations were built, it is a difference indeed. So we can take great pride in this document, we can take great pride in the benefits that it's wrought in the world since its inception, and we can take great pride in the governance of Scotland. Thank you very much. I think I'm handing over to Graeme at this point.
Ready for you now, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning over there. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Bellassai and Camilla and all the team that have organised it. I went to the last one in Detroit and enjoyed it. I would have been at this one had it been time to take place, but I spent my life in America. My partner is in Tennessee. Sadly, she's there and I'm here, divided by ocean and COVID. Like when we're going to see each other again, but I love of America and I love of Scotland. History is a great thing that allows for, in fact, needs disagreement, debate, and I suspect that what I'm about to say is going to turn out. So anyway, I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, and I would just say before I start what I was going to say that I'm glad that Lord Bruce and Donna have talked so much about the actual declaration itself, which is a remarkable document from what they say about it. More, I'm going to talk more about fire, if you write it, and the political situation that caused the declaration to be written, and particularly the connection or non-connection of the Highlands, because I come to it as a Highland historian. But as a Highland historian, the first thing you notice is how few Highland names are on it. There are maybe 8 that may be considered the names of present-day Highland clans, i.e. Ross, Sutherland, Fraser, Murray, Campbell, Cameron, Stewart, and Sinclair as Sinclair. Why are there not more? If one compares this list with the barons who pledged to support Margaret of Norway as Queen in 1284, and with those who agreed to the provisions of the Treaty of Salisbury and Burgundy in 1290, what immediately strikes one is the lack of any representation in 1320 of clans Norway. All 3 of whose main branches, MacDougall, MacDonald, and MacCrory, are represented in 1284, one of whom is included in 1290, MacDougall. Given that Angus Fogg was one of Bruce's most loyal followers, the lack of a MacDonald signature stands out, so it can probably be explained by a struggle then going on to distinguish the reason for Angus. So what are the rest of the Highland clans? After all, if you read their own history, they were all at Bannockburn, fighting alongside Robert. Okay, I exaggerate. Some clans have no choice but to admit to their ancestors' well-documented enmity of Bruce the Usurper. Such clans had their own particular reasons for fighting on the side of Edward of England, and it had little to do with any desire to kowtow to the son of the Hammer of the Scots. For the Cummings, it was to avenge the murder by Bruce of John Cummin of Bannockburn. For the MacDougalls, it was to try and fend off the rising power of the Macdonalds, who had first accepted English gold to further their cousins, before attaching themselves to the rising star of Bruce in order to consolidate their gains in Argyll alongside the Campbells. Yes, Campbells and Macdonalds were on the same side in those days. Many others, however, are able to use the paucity of contemporary records to make more or less ridiculous claims of perpetual loyalty to the victorious king, including the 2 clans I'm attached to, the Mackenzie and Macmillan. 17th century Mackenzie historians not only say our chief was at Bannockburn, but that he had previously sheltered Bruce in Ronan when he was a spider-inspired fugitive, and had attended him in Inverness when he came north to rally support in the Highlands. They assert that to do so, Mackenzie had to defy his feudal superior, the Earl of Ross, and the clan's future superiors, the Lords of the Isles, all of which plays into the clan's spin, which emphasises the Mackenzie's perpetual loyalty to the crown. There is not, however, the slightest shred of evidence to support any of this. Such indications as there are suggest the Mackenzie chiefs or their ancestors, since there's some doubt that the clan even existed at this time, were related by marriage to the MacDougalls and likely therefore to have been opponents of Bruce, as indeed originally was the Earl of Ross. He, however, changed sides and fought for Bruce at Bannockburn, which suggests the early Mackenzie's or other ancestors probably were with the king at that battle as followers of the Earl. However, we can't know that for sure, and indeed we have no certain information at all about the Mackenzies and their doings until a century after Bannockburn. We're on slightly firmer ground when it comes to the Macmillans. They came into existence over a century before the Wars of Independence, and though their early history is extremely obscure, the fourth record of the name shows a Macmillan having his lands in Galloway granted away by Robert the Bruce a few years before Bannockburn because he had fought for the rightful king, John Balliol. That makes the so-called tradition about being allowed by Bruce to use the colours of the royal standard for their oldest tartan as a reward for their loyalty at Bannockburn and elsewhere a complete fairy tale. Then Highlanders have always loved fairy tales. What goes for Mackenzie also goes for many other Highland clans, i.e. that their early chiefs or ancestors fought in the Wars of Independence as followers of the earls to whom they owed a kindred allegiance, or of the barons, that's the king's tenants in chief, that they followed or from whom they held their land. It's those earls and barons, or at least some of them, those then giving their allegiance to King Robert, that appear in the Declaration of Arbroath as the community of the realm of Scotland. Each one of these may be said to represent his own community, of his earldom or his barony, which would consist of all the knights, tenants, and chiefs that owed allegiance to him. So just as the Earl of Ross probably represented Mackenzie, Mathesons, and Munros, all their ancestors at Arbroath, so the Earl of Strathern probably represented MacGregors, MacNabs, and MacLarens, or their ancestors, and the Earl of Lennox probably represented Buchanans, MacFarlanes, and Galbraiths, or their ancestors. Same is true when you look at the list of those agreeing to the documents of 1284 and 1290, both of which lists come closer than the Declaration of Arbroath, really representing the whole community of the realm of Scotland before it was split asunder by the Great Cause and the wars that followed. Let's come back, however, to the names in the Declaration that we've identified as more or less Highland and consider them in more detail. When we do so, what we find is only 2 or 3 of these individuals represent families with power bases in the Highlands: the Earl of Ross, the Earl of Sutherland, and the latter's distant cousin, Alan Murray of Kelvin. So it's arguable that the Murray's most important lands at this time were in Lanarkshire, where the might of Bothwell Castle was a clear indication of their power. If one was to believe the 17th century history of his clan, then Donald Campbell represented a kindred with its roots in Argyll, where the descendants of Donald's brother Neil would one day become the Earls. However, as Stephen Boardman has shown, there are indications that Campbell may actually have originated in the Stirlingshire area, with ties to the Stuarts in Menteith and the Firth of Clyde, which the Bruces in Carrick. In due course, it was in Angus that Donald came to have his lordship, and in Ayrshire that his descendants became a significant branch of the clan, the Campbells of Loudon. Moving from the clan of the Crooked Mouth to the clan of the Crooked Nose brings us to John Cameron, the Laird of Ballagano, which is far from O'Hara, the home of the Highland Camerons. It's in East Ayrshire, close to the border with Angus and not far from a place called Cameron in Fife, from which the family may take their name. By no means certain the Camerons of Ballagano were the ancestors of the Highland clans of the same name, though heraldry might suggest they were. The reenacting Fraser Highlanders in North America and the historical soap opera Outland have all made Fraser one of the most famous names. The Alexander Fraser who signed the Declaration of Arbroath, however, was the Lord of Touch in Stirlingshire, with ancestors from Tweedale, and had little to do with the Highlands, though his father had acquired lands in Caithness by marriage, and descendants of his brother Simon were to become the famous Frasers of Lovat. That was for the future. In 1320, the lordship of Lovat was in the hands of someone else who signed the declaration, and his name is not generally considered to belong to the Highlands. Patrick Graeme of Lovat had come into his lordship in Aird, the area west of Inverness, around the estuary of the River Bewley, by marriage to one of the daughters of John Bishop, a member of one of the great Anglo-Norman families in 13th century Scotland, who had acquired considerable estates in the Highlands. Though Graeme was later used as the English equivalent of the Gaelic name MacElverne, the Graemes who signed the Declaration of Arbroath belonged to another Highland family, another Anglo-Norman family. The fact that no less than 3 Graemes were signatories shows how important this family were at that time. But despite Patrick's inheritance of Lovat, their sojourn in the Highlands was too brief, though many of the later lands were on its periphery. Another signatory at Arbroath also inherited lands in Aird by marriage to one of his daughters. John Fenton of Bakey and Beaufort belonged to a family who took their name from the manor in East Lothian, but whose power base in the 13th century seems to be in Forfar, where John's grandfather had been the sheriff of Forfar. Like John Fenton, William Mowatt's family had lands in Angus, where they were the lords of Fern. Their Highland connection was as the hereditary sheriffs of Cromarty, but by the 18th century the name was rare there, though it had become common in Caithness. The question that arises at this point is whether any of these dignitaries who had a Highland connection considered themselves as representing the Highlands, let alone as being Highland or the chiefs of Highland clans. The answer is almost certainly no, especially as the cultural divide between the Gaeltacht and the Scots-speaking Romans didn't really exist at the time. As we've seen, most of these men had more important lands out with the Highlands and probably only came to the Highlands when the king found it necessary to travel there or when instructed by the king to do so on his behalf. One might expect the exceptions to this rule to be the local earls and sheriffs, since they were charged with ensuring the king's peace and collecting his taxes. But most of them were courtiers too, and needed to spend as much time as possible doing the king's will with the king, wherever he was, lest rivals gain an edge in the ongoing game of courtly snakes and ladders. The bigger the baron, the less likely his vassals were to see him in person, not only because he was even more desperate to be in the company of the king from whom all favour flowed, but because he had so many localities to look after on the king's behalf. Take the bearers of one of the names that obviously could not appear on the declaration, coming, and see how, at the height of their power, perhaps 40 years previously, their chiefs bestrode the kingdom. Alan Young illustrated it as shown on the screen. Here was a family, also of Anglo-Norman origin, who came to have basic influences in every corner of 13th century Scotland. At one time or another, they held 4 earldoms and the giant Highland lordship of Badenoch and Lochaber, which amounted to much of the old province of Murray. What is most striking, however, is the fact that the most powerful individuals in this family managed to hold positions, not just in the Highlands and the Central Belt, but in the most distantly separated parts of Scotland. So Alexander, Earl of Buchan, was simultaneously the Sheriff of Wigton and of Dingwall, while John I, Lord of Lochaber, was also the Deputy of Walloway. After their downfall, the pan Scottish clan family became in due course the Highland clan. Stirlingshire Frasers became the Frasers of Lovat, the Sinclairs of Rosslyn became the Sinclairs of Caithness, and the Camerons of Belgano may or may not become the Camerons of Lochiel. Looked at in the light of these other examples, that doesn't appear such an unlikely occurrence. Indeed, such examples may shed light on similar questions regarding the claimed relationships of the Griersons in Galloway to the Highland MacGregors, of the MacUlric in Lochaber to the great Ayrshire family of Kennedy, or the MacNabs, or the MacCraths in Dumfriesshire to the MacRae in Tale. Clan history has always in the past been looked at through the prism of what we might call the classic clan of the 17th and 18th century, a view which is misleading in many ways, but particularly in relation to the idea that a clan has always been tied to, indeed is almost defined by one area. When I was a boy, being brought up as a Scot in England and coming home to visit my granny, as important as driving past the Welcome to Scotland sign at Carter Bar was entering Ross, when my father would always say, "Now you're in Mackenzie country." But has it always been Mackenzie country? Light is being shed on this and similar questions from many other clans by the invaluable work of Bonnie and Mary Black, interpreting the famous, infamous, collection of old genealogies known as MS 1467. Clan historians have struggled for decades to make sense of the various interpretations of what these pedigrees say, let alone what they mean. But now, due to the Blacks' meticulous comparison of colour scans and black and white photos taken using ultraviolet light and their knowledge of medieval scripts, we can at last be more confident about the names on some of them. Ronnie Black has written a series of papers interpreting what he and Murray have found in the genealogies of the various clans. What he's written about the Mackenzies and the clans shown in MS 1467 to have had a common origin with them is particularly interesting. These other clans are Gillanders, sometimes said to be the original name of the Rosses, the Mathesons, and the enigmatic kindred of the Green Abbot. We have no time to go into detail about the derivations he suggests for these clans, but given the identity of our keynote speaker last night, it's fascinating to see that the Morrisons of Ness on the Isle of Lewis would perhaps have been the kindred of the Green Abbot and have hailed from Strathern in Yorkshire. The possibility that Clan Gillanders may have been connected to the Macheckans in Kintyre, the Mathesons may have been in origin a mobile mercenary force with a branch serving the Kennedys in Ayrshire particularly intriguing. And as it is suggested that the Mackenzies may have been a minor client kindred of southern origin. This last suggestion is based in part on the work of Angus MacConnick, whose Gaelic language PhD was an investigation into the possible origins of the Mackenzies. He draws our attention to the existence in Banffshire of a place called Roth Mackenzie, which might suggest an alternative origin for the clan. Very close to and may originally have been part of the lordship of King Edward, which the Earls of Ross acquired by marriage to one of the heiresses of the last common Earl of Buchan. But the Christino Mackenzie, the heiress of the last common, who gave his name to it, had lands in this area prior to that marriage. Previous Earl of Buchan had, however, as we've seen, been Sheriff of Dingwood. So a member of the nascent Mackenzie kindred in Ross could well have attached himself to the coming revenue earlier in the 13th century and received these lands as a reward. Not impossible, too, that he or a member of his family did save the king from a stag in Mar, where the Mackenzies of Dalmore were later to constitute the largest branch of the clan out with Ross, even if it's unlikely it was called Colin Fitzgerald. What the early histories of many clans show is that at this time, Gaelic kindreds had lands and interests in different parts of Scotland, just like the great Anglo-Norman families. Ancestors of the early modern clans were members of aristocratic medieval families, some Gaels, some Norse, some Anglo-Norman or Flemish in origin, who served a greater lord and ultimately a king from whom they received lands and heiresses, who brought them more lands in different parts of what may have been their native earldoms and then of the kingdom. They spent their lives moving from one lordship to another by horse or by boat, fighting, dispensing justice, living off the labours of the peasantry, to whom it probably mattered not a jot what the terms were by which their lord held his land, allodial or feudal, or whether they considered themselves Scottish or not. That begs the question, what did being Scottish mean in the late 13th and early 14th century? Primarily, it meant being a vassal of the King of Scots, who asserted his right to be recognised as the liege lord of all his barons. The use of the term vassal embodies the contractual relationship at the heart of feudalism, which gave the barons rights as well as responsibilities in relation to their lord the king. It was these rights, or liberties, which were expressed in England in Magna Carta, with the implicit threat that the king who did not abide by them might be deposed. So if the English King John had not succumbed to a surfeit of peaches and cider in 1216, he may well have suffered the same fate that was later accorded to the Scottish King John, and also at the hands of a neighbouring king to whom some of his barons owed fealty. Much has been written recently about influences on the Declaration of Arbroath of Aristotelian ideas that appeared to justify the deposition of firing. Much is made of the signatory statement that Robert the Bruce too could suffer that fate if he sold Scotland out. Given that King Robert only reigned because King John had been deposed, what else could they say? Or more to the point, what else could Bruce himself say? It's pretty obvious the declaration must have come into being at his command, albeit one of his clerical advisors may have suggested it, and Abbot Bernard may have written it, and that the signatories would have had little choice about putting their names to it. It's ironic that so many of them were soon to lose their lives, their liberties, or their lands after being accused of trying to do exactly what the declaration said was justifiable. It's been suggested that the Stuarts and the others accused of conspiring with him against Bruce were forced to sign the declaration precisely because they were known or suspected dissidents, thus making the declaration an even more potent piece of propaganda. It's certainly striking how many of the signatories had in the past been active opponents of Robert the Bruce or the so-called Patriot cause, particularly men like the Earl of Ross, who had handed Bruce's family over to the English, and Jonathan Mackenzie, who had Warwick. However, if you go through the known loyalties of all the signatories of the Declaration and of their predecessors and successors, what you find is that virtually all their families changed sides at one stage in the Wars of Independence, driven by the need to survive and, if possible, to use the demands for their support to feather their own nests. That's hardly surprising when the biggest turncoat of all was Robert Bruce himself, who, as soon as his father died, was clearly determined to be the King of Scots, whatever it took. Given his past record, it's simply incredible to suppose that, before he became king, Robert was fighting for anything other than Bruce, still less for some abstract idea like freedom, as defined 450 years later by enlightened Scots or revolting Americans. Sorry, I probably should rephrase that, Americans engaged in revolution. But whatever we may think about the morals of a sacrilegious murderer and serial traitor to both the kings to whom he owed or gave allegiance, one has to admire Bruce's ruthless determination to hang on once he reached the top, and his clear-headed appreciation of the need to change the terms of engagement for all those involved, so as to ensure that others could not do to him what he had done to Bailiff. So it was that his barons were no longer allowed to hold land in England, and he did, since that involved giving homage to the King of England and being diverted from the duty owed to the King of Scots by threats against those lands. Those who refused to give up their lands in England lost their lands in Scotland. They had to choose, some would say, between being Scotsmen or Englishmen. So, reading back from the era of nation state, this has been seen as a transitional moment, as much about Scotland finally coming into being as about Scots throwing off the shackles of English dominion. For freedom alone, thus the claim echoes down through the centuries. And what are its limits? Scotland free of England, America free of Britain, Britain free of Europe, Scotland free of Britain, perhaps the Highlands free of the Central Belt, or Orkney and Shetland free to rejoin Norway, or maybe even free to make Scotland great again. I think I'd better stop right there.
Thank you, Graeme. If I may just interject, we're having some difficulties with your audio quality. It may be beyond your control, but if you could speak up a little bit, that might help. You were kind of cutting in and out. We're going to do what we can to repair that in the recording we're making of this, and maybe we could even put some captions under it. Your slides were clear. Your voice is a bit muffled.
Sorry about that.
Bruce, it's on to you.
And back to our panel then.
I think we might have some questions in the chat there. I think I see a question from John Cherry there, which is actually not addressed to me, hooray. It's actually addressed to Lord Bruce. And it's about, if I could just get it up here, John says, Lord Bruce impressively points to the Battle of Bannockburn as a defining event in the development of Scottish identity. Could he expand on that?
Well, Donna, I think that was the quote from John Buchan, okay, who laid aside his pen, writing about the adventures of Richard Hannay, to write the appeal notice to raise the money to save the field of the battle before it was covered in council houses. Just very briefly, John, if you're still watching, I think the really important point is that if you share a bed with an elephant, there's always a risk of getting squashed. And this is the existential fear, if you like, that grips the Scottish imagination through the medieval period. It's a fear which, continues beyond that period. So the battle was so important because it lifted the threat of invasion. It lifted the threat of another terrible sort of scorched earth type invasion, which we had suffered under Edward I. And it gave us, as John Buchan said, it gave us the parity with the much more powerful neighbour. And I mean, Donna and Graeme, I'm sure, can bear me out on this, but there are continual moments in Scottish history when we achieve that parity, such as when James VI becomes James I of Great Britain, or when George IV comes to Edinburgh on the King's jaunt and is allowed to touch the crown of Scotland. There are many moments in our history, and Bannockburn is obviously a very important one.
Yes, thank you very much. And we have another question here from Jo Watson, who's right here in the Highlands of Scotland, and this is for Graeme. She says, I'd like to ask Mr. Mackenzie a question. Please, can he tell me his source regarding the Bruce bestowing the colours of red and yellow to a specific clan to wear? Many thanks. Over to you, Graeme.
Well, it's a myth. There is no actual source. There is a past historian of Clan Macmillan, the man who wrote the the first history of the clan in the 1950s, he came up with this, claiming it was a tradition. He claimed that Robert the Bruce had been sheltered by Macmillan on Loch Tayside and taken down to Galloway so that he could get back to Annandale. There's absolutely no evidence for this. And as I say, the only evidence we have about the Macmillans is they were actually on the other side. So it's a complete myth, I'm afraid. It's a nice story, but like so many myths about Highland clans, they're nice stories, but not much there. And try looking for actual sources.
Thanks very much, Graeme. And we have another question panel. It's for all of us. It's from Julian Bell. And Julian says, I would like to ask you each how you think the Declaration of Arbroath faded into obscurity so quickly. And I'll maybe start with that, if that's all right, because obviously in my presentation, I was talking about the physical existence of the document itself. And in medieval times, we have a great fragility of transmission with documents. For example, the great wealth of Scottish poetry that we have from the medieval period is almost entirely down to the Bannatyne manuscript, which was written down by the said Bannatyne when he was sick. When he was sick, it says, and he wrote down all his favourite poems and songs and things like that. And that's the only source we have for some of them. So in a very real physical sense, it's not surprising that it was the equivalent of the modern way of popping in a drawer and forgetting all about it in many ways. And of course, time rolled on and Scotland's role changed in status. But I'd like to ask you, Lord Bruce, what you think about that. And then perhaps Graeme could come in.
Well, I think to an extent, a lot of it, I mentioned the Declaration of the Clergy, 1309, and the Great Charter given to Aberdeen, which also contain the phraseology to an extent of some of the ideas that came expressed in the Declaration. And then, of course, you have Barbour's account of the King's life. So many of the ideas contained within the Declaration are carried in other documents, which did endure possibly more successfully than the Declaration itself.
And Graeme, any thoughts yourself?
Not really, no. I mean, I think at the time it was one of a number of documents that would have come back and forth between Scotland and the papacy, and indeed England and the papacy, and so on. And I suspect that events sort of overtook it. It was recovered later on, and people began to realise what an amazing document it was.
Well, that's true, and it ties into our next question, which is from Joan. And Joan asks, the declaration was sent to the Pope. How did it make its way back to Scotland, Graeme?
Well, I think that's one actually where I would bow to your professional knowledge. I have no idea how it made its way back to Scotland.
Well, of course, they will have made a copy of it.
Yes.
In the first instance, so it may not actually physically, the original document may not have made it back there, because naturally the prudent scribe would make a copy of these valuable documents.
But Donna, what's the point? Is there a copy in the Vatican Library?
Yes, there is.
Have you seen it?
No, I haven't. Well, I've seen it virtually.
Right.
Through very kind offices of a very kind gentleman. But there is a copy in the Vatican Library. So I suspect, I don't know, and this is a really interesting question from Joan, actually. I'm going to have to go away and have a think about that. But I suspect that we had a copy here and a copy went there. And that's basically what happened. So there was no actual back and forthery, if I can use that very academic term.
But then, of course, there were two other letters which made up the declaration. What happened to them?
Well, they're contained in, I think, in the Vatican Library as well. They are there. It was a package, as I said in my presentation. There was a package of information that went over there. But the Vatican Library is the most tremendous resource. Of course, we can only access a very, very small part of that, but they certainly were very good at keeping things. And I suppose it's like just to throw in the, go to left field a little bit here and throw in the Vikings for a moment. But the reason that we have so many saga manuscripts is because they're written down by monks in Iceland, which was not torn apart by internecine warfare and was a safe and calm environment, and things were kept. Whereas we have absolutely nothing to speak of actually written at the time by the Norse themselves, apart from some runic inscriptions on sticks and so on, because of the nature of what was going on there. So the Vatican Library may be a sea of calm in the turbulence of a war-torn Europe, and thus it's probably one of our best resources, if not the best resource for documents of the time. A nice comment here from Andrew Dunrussell to us all. These 3 presentations would make an excellent little publication complete with illustrations for the anniversary. Perhaps the School of Scottish Studies in Toronto or UHI would be interested in publishing it. Well, you can certainly take that back to our team at UHI. I'm just checking to see if there are any more questions. There are no more questions coming in now. I think we have time perhaps for another question if anybody's bursting with enthusiasm to send one to us. But in the meantime, just to check there, I'd like to ask both Lord Bruce and Graeme, how do you think the perception of the Declaration of Arbroath has affected Scottish identity? There's a huge question to finish this session on, but go on, let's go for it. Do you think the reality or the perception has had the greater effect on the Scottish identity, Scottish cultural identity? Graeme, I'll start with you because you're looming large up on my screen as we speak.
Well, I wonder how large it does loom in the lives and knowledge of most Scots. I mean, you know, we're all historians of one sort or another and interested in the subject. And you might almost think that it's possible that it's known more about in America, where it seemed to be such an important influence, rightly or wrongly, on the Declaration of Independence. So maybe more Americans know about it than ordinary Scots, as it were. I'm not quite sure about that.
That's a really interesting point, Graeme, because we do find that diaspora communities tend to hold on in a more self-conscious way, perhaps, to markers of cultural identity. That's very true. And over to you, Lord Bruce.
Well, Donna, I'm old enough to have been at university when Scottish history started to be taught in the early 1980s. I studied at St Andrews under Christopher Smout. So to an extent, there was still an awful lot of catching up to do. And I think what I was trying to say is that the reality of the document, and as you brought out much more proficient than I was able to do, is highly complex. So you do have to have an understanding of that period in order to set the context. So I think I would agree with Graeme at the moment. It's the perception rather than reality, which is the important driver of identity.
Well, that's yes. I must say I have to agree with you there. Now, excitingly, we have 2 more questions coming in here. One from David Campbell, who's in Oakland, California. Welcome, David. And he says, could the Declaration of Arbroath come about at an earlier or later point or points in history, or did it arise in its rightful moment in time in history? What do we think about that? I'll pass that to you, Lord Bruce, if I may.
Well, I was trying to point out that, in fact, there is this continuity. And if you can go back to 1309, the period of the King's First Parliament, the Declaration of the Clergy, I think that's a really important precursor, if you like, of the Declaration of Arbroath.
Thank you. And there's a quick query from Jo Watson. She'd like to know if that's a skull behind you.
It is actually. It's one of the 6 casts of the mould taken of the King's skull when the body was found in Dunfermline Abbey in 1818. I thought the sort of rush of madness, I'll just stick it up there on the mantelpiece behind me for this.
I must say, I did notice it myself and I was peeling away at it to try and work out what it was. Now, we have a final question from Deb Bruce Gottlieb, and it's actually addressed to me, and it is there any documented proof that the Declaration of Arbroath was used for the Declaration of Independence and Claim of Rights? Well, Deb, unfortunately, Thomas Jefferson did not write in his diary, today I am reading the Declaration of Arbroath with a view to putting it into the Declaration of Independence. So I suppose when it comes to, certainly the Claim of Rights in 1689, we certainly have reason to believe that the Declaration of Arbroath was looked at because they were requiring a document from in the Scottish tradition to refer to. And it's certainly, there are allusions to it, but unfortunately, as so often happens in history, they don't write us nice handy memos. It would be lovely, and I shall endeavour to find one if I can somewhere for you, Deb. And if I do find that, I will send that to you.
May I interject a question?
Surely.
I saw in the list of questions one that maybe we'll throw out there to Lord Bruce. What do you think current politicians, not specifying anybody in any place, could learn from King Robert as a politician, as a leader, as a national leader? Any takeaways for the modern world there?
Yeah, I think he had courage, which I think is a preeminent virtue from which everything else flows. But he was very astute at PR. I mean, I think there's a lot of his character, I think, actually flows through the Declaration. And I think it was an accurate interpretation of how he sought to establish not only his legitimacy, but how he wanted to be remembered for posterity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On the subject of the influence of the Declaration of Arbroath on the American Declaration of Independence, the evidence is circumstantial. As Professor Heddle mentioned, there's no clear silver bullet that shows it. There's a lot of current scholarship going on, which suggests that Jefferson was certainly aware of it. Many other sources of inspiration too, but that he was aware of it. And I think that's the important takeaway there. I don't know that we have any other questions. If we don't, I think we're going to move on and thank the.
Sorry, John. Donna here. There is one final question that's come in, and it's for Lord Bruce, who's certainly earning his tea and cake here, I think. And it's from Don Cummer, and it says, is there a connection between the Declaration and the Rebellion Losses Bill?
Yes, there is, and it's the moral courage of a Bruce. Yes, and of course you have the legacy in Montreal of a little plaque which shows you where you burnt your Parliament down. Yes, I think my ancestors' moral courage was able to keep Canada safe from, if you like, unnecessary repercussions. Very few unnecessary lives were lost after that event. But thank you very much for linking the two together.